Hey everybody, happy Wednesday. Welcome back to my channel. And I've got a really exciting video for you today. So this whole week has been just incredibly exciting for me with language learning. If you have been watching my videos for a while, you might have seen Monday's episode where I actually did my very first video all in German. And I've been developing my German fluency completely by myself, right? So I haven't actually spoken to a person in German in like 5 years since I was in Hamburg. And of course I stopped studying it for a long time. It got incredibly rusty and my German was a lot worse back then anyway. So I started reviving my German recently and I've been documenting it. So you can actually go back and see the first video where I showed you how bad my German had gotten. I've done a few updates. And so on Monday, it was my first all German video. And I was actually I was blown away by how positive the feedback was from not just people in general, but also native speakers of German. I honestly did not expect people to be so pleased with the progress I had made. And what you see in that video, if you haven't watched it already, I recommend seeing it either before or after finishing this video. That is starting to approach that basic level of fluency that I keep talking about recently. And I think that video is evidence of how well I can accomplish that without really talking to people. I haven't had any conversations with German speakers at all since getting back to the language. And so today we're going to be talking about exactly what I've been doing recently and a specific method that I've been finding really exciting. So first, we're gonna just outline the general problem area that we're trying to solve for. Then I'm gonna sort of break down what I call the podcast interview method. It's a thing that I showcased a little bit in that previous video, but I'm gonna break it down for you step by step today. And then finally, I'm gonna actually give you a really simple framework that you can sort of, base that method in, but it makes it so much more effective. And that's exactly what I have been doing this last week with German and now also Mandarin Chinese. So without further ado, let's grab our coffee. I'm back to my whale blue mug. It's been a while, I love it so much. And let's jump into the video. Okay, so the general problem that we're solving here with this method is the very issue of developing a basic level of fluency, a basic level of comfort expressing yourself in a foreign language, which in my case, as I've said a lot recently, I like to do fairly independently. Again, if I have the opportunity to speak with someone in German or Mandarin Chinese or whatever language I'm learning, I'll happily take it, but I'm generally perfectly content developing that basic fluency mostly by myself. The problem often is that if you just tell people, talk to yourself, people get quite uncomfortable with the idea of just talking to themselves, right? And so we're trying to figure out what are some ways to make that activity much more comfortable and also much more enjoyable, and frankly, how can we make it more effective? And so I've spent a lot of years developing my own methods and working with different people, especially when I was teaching languages full time. And it's really become something that I don't just do and it's not fun, but it works. No, I actually really enjoy the process of building that basic fluency by myself. And so that brings us to the second part of the video, which is my podcast interview method. Now, the reason why I call it the podcast interview method is because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I really enjoy that sort of interview format. It's not that different than the radio or even a documentary. I just frame it that way. And the reason why I like the framing of an interview is that it's something that we're all probably familiar with, right? So if you just tell someone, hey, just talk to yourself, well, people are kind of uncomfortable with that and it doesn't necessarily seem terribly natural perhaps, or it's too vague, right? I find that what works best with things like this is give people a framing and a context that they are familiar and comfortable with. And it really helps you to just focus on doing the activity. And it helps you just remove the ambiguity. So when you frame it as an interview, it's really nice because there's a question and an answer, right? It's fairly well structured. And so what I like to do is basically pick a question, and it must be a question that has a fairly deep answer, right? Something that I have a lot to say about, something that I have feelings about, I have opinions about, a question or a subject that I have an emotional connection with, because this is going to give me so much content, right? That I can sort of provide the interviewer, which in this case happens to also be me. So again, the reason why I love this sort of method is it gives you a very specific and also a very familiar framing and context. And really all you have to do is put yourself in the shoes of someone being interviewed. And it's really, really fun. I just love this. I did it a ton with French. I used to take these long walks every day listening to a wonderful podcast called Laissez-Vous Tenter, which I'll link down below if I can find the link. It's like a daily cultural news podcast in French. So it's all things like news about new books and new plays, new TV shows, movies, interviews with all kinds of really cool people. And so I used to pretend that I was a guest on Laissez-Vous Tenter, and I just really, really like this framing. So I've done this a lot over the years and it's really effective, but recently I came up with a little framework that you can base this method in, and oh my God, it makes it so much more powerful, and that's what I've been doing a lot recently. So now let's talk about the framework. What I like to do is pick one really interesting interview question, and at the beginning of the week, so I do this on Mondays, that's my question, right? So what I've been doing this week is I asked myself, tell us about this really interesting sort of coffee morning ritual that you have. We've heard that you really just love coffee, and that it's a lot more than just the flavor of coffee. There is this sort of ritual that you have in the morning around the craftsmanship and even things like cleaning the machine, setting everything up. Tell us about why this is so special to you and how did this come about, right? And so the cool thing is, even in the question, right, there's quite a lot there. But then I will spend 10 or 15, maybe even 20 minutes just basically answering the question. And it's really, really interesting because what I do is I answer that same question every day for the whole week, right? So every morning I ask the same question, right? And then every morning I also answer the same question. Now you might think immediately like, okay, that sounds a bit boring, that sounds a bit repetitive. But here's the thing, is that the first time you try to ask the question, you're gonna find that it's quite difficult, right? You're gonna find that there's things you don't know how to say. And so what I do is I have a basic little notebook. This could be a handwritten notebook, it could be inside of Notion, and I'll write things down. I look them up, right? I use things like Google Translate, whatever tool you might have for the language you're learning, and I create a little, notebook full of, phrases, words. And yeah, the first day it's a bit clunky. And the same thing when I go to answer the question. I find that, wow, yeah, I discover a lot of simple words, connector things, conjunctions, all kinds of really cool, helpful, connective tissue of what it means to speak a language in a conversation. I discover those gaps. So same thing, I'm looking up words, I'm, constantly referencing the dictionary or whatever. But then the second day, I've got some groundwork, right? But the thing is that I'm not creating a script. And so what happens is on day number 2, when I ask the question, I will inevitably have some variation, right? I'm not gonna ask it the exact same way. So what happens is you do get the repetition and the practice, and it is very much like practicing a script as an actor or an actress, right? But there is this inevitable variation, and so it keeps it interesting because you start to explore, ways to tweak the question, and the same thing with the answer. But then here is the thing. As you do this for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, you actually start to become really comfortable both asking the question and answering the question, right? It's really interesting because what happens is you find that you start to really internalize all the core vocabulary, all the core words that are related to the question, right? So in my case, I had words like espresso machine. Didn't know how to say that in German. Turns out it's quite easy. It's very similar to the English. But you know, there are all these vocabulary words that are quite specific to the topic that we're talking about. But you also get really comfortable with things like although, and then, well, but, you know, also, or especially, all these really, really helpful words that, like I said, these things, they're essentially the connective tissue of any conversation. And I find that what happens to lots of people when they try to speak in a language, they really struggle because they're missing that connective tissue. They often have vocabulary words, they've learned the grammar, they've learned things, but there are just these really interesting things that you don't have. And even if you've learned them, you're not necessarily comfortable with them. So by practicing the same question and the same answer every day, you start to really get comfortable with that particular question, that particular answer. And over time, as you get more comfortable giving that same answer, giving that same question, you start to vary it more and more. So, you know, maybe the first 3 or 4 days, I kind of tell the same few stories, I say really similar things, but there's a bit of variation. By day 5, 6, and 7, I've gotten so comfortable giving that answer that maybe I start to really change things up. Maybe I try telling a whole new story. It's so powerful because it creates a place of comfort, right? You get comfortable in a very specific conversation, and so you also then feel comfortable innovating with your answer, right? Exploring, varying, you know, improvising, which is very similar to how it actually works in a real conversation. And again, the key here is you're not memorizing a script. And so then on week 2, you start fresh, right? You ask yourself a whole new question and you give a whole new answer. And what you're gonna find is that now there's a whole new set of vocabulary that you need, right? Maybe now I'm gonna ask myself a question about traveling, I don't know, food. So there's gonna be all these new words, but you'll find that that connective tissue, how you structure a response, how you structure a question, how you connect stories together, how you connect ideas, how you contradict a point, how you support an argument, that's all the same. So I love this method because over time you expand your vocabulary, but what's happening is you're just constantly reinforcing how comfortable you are speaking in the language, and you're like building up this extremely strong foundation of connective tissue that really just, it's the fabric of a conversation. So it's so powerful, it's not gonna make you a perfect speaker, it's not gonna make you flawless, but what it does is it gets you comfortable expressing yourself, and I think it's so powerful. Now at this point, some of you might be asking, you know, how do you know you're not making tons of mistakes? How do you know that you're saying accurate sentences? Well, I have a whole video that I made all about that, which I'll link down below and on the screen here. But I also do want to say, at this stage, it's also okay to be making some mistakes. What we're doing here is we're building that amazing foundation and a really decent level of basic fluency so that when I start talking to people, I'm so ready for that, and there's still so much time to iron out mistakes and refine my overall proficiency in the language. Okay, everybody, I really hope that you enjoyed that video. I have found this to be so helpful this week with my German and certainly now my Mandarin Chinese, so I will look forward to also showcasing this sort of basic fluency I'm trying to build right now with Mandarin as well. With that, I wish you a wonderful Wednesday, and I'll see you back here on Friday for another video.